Chapter 4, To Kill a Mockingbird, Reader's Digest Edition, Part 1. After many telephone calls and much pleading with his mother, it was decided that Dill could stay in Maycomb. We had a week of peace together. After that, a nightmare was upon us. It began one evening after supper. Dill was over, and Alexandra was in her chair in the corner, Atticus in his. Jim and I were on the floor reading. There was a knock on the front door, and Jim answered it and said it was Mr. Heck Tate. "Well, ask him to come in," said Atticus. "I already did. There's some men in the yard. They want you to come out." Atticus went out, and Jim turned out the living room lights and pressed his nose to a window screen. Dill and I took another window. A crowd of men was standing around Atticus. They all seemed to be talking at once. "Moving him into the county jail tomorrow," Mr. Tate was saying. "I don't look for any trouble, but I can't guarantee." "Don't be foolish, Heck," Atticus said. "This is Maycomb. Today is Saturday. Trial will probably be Monday. You can keep him one night, can't you? I don't think anybody in Maycomb will begrudge me a client with times this hard." There was a murmur of amusement that died suddenly when Mr. Link Diaz said, "It's that old Sarum bunch I'm worried about." "You're not scared of that crowd, are you?" Atticus said. "You know how they do when they get shinnied up." "They don't drink on Sunday. They go to church," Atticus said. "This is a special occasion," someone said. "Don't see why you touched the case in the first place," Mr. Link Diaz was saying. "You've got everything to lose from this, Atticus. Everything." "Do you really think so?" This was Atticus's dangerous question. "Do you really want to move there, Scout?" Bam, 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 and the checkerboard was swept clean of my men. "Link, that boy might go to the chair, but he's not going till the truth's told." Atticus's voice was even. "And you know what the truth is." There was an ominous murmur among the men. Suddenly Jim screamed, "Atticus, the telephone's ringing." The men jumped a little and scattered. They were people we saw every day, merchants, in-town farmers, Dr. Reynolds. "Well, answer it, son," called Atticus. Laughter broke them up. Atticus came back to the living room and calmly picked up the evening paper. "They were after you, weren't they?" Jim went to him. He was pale except for the vivid mark of the window screen on his nose. Atticus lowered the paper and gazed at Jim. He said gently, "No, son, those were our friends." "It wasn't a gang?" Atticus tried to stifle a smile, but didn't make it. "No, we don't have mobs and gangs and that nonsense in Maycomb." "How about the Ku Klux? Didn't they go after Catholics?" "Never heard of any Catholics in Maycomb either," said Atticus. "You're confusing that with something else. Way back about 1920, there was a Klan, but it couldn't find anybody to scare. They paraded by Mr. Sam Levy's house one night, but Sam just stood on his porch and told him things had come to a pretty pass. He'd sold them the very sheets on their backs. Sam made them so ashamed of themselves they went away. The Klan's gone now, and it'll never come back." Next day was Sunday. In the interval between Sunday school and church, I saw Atticus standing in the churchyard with a knot of men. Mr. Heck Tate was present, and I wondered if he had seen the light. He never went to church. Even Mr. Braxton Underwood was there. Mr. Underwood had no use for any organization but the Maycomb Tribune, of which he was the sole owner, editor, and printer. Something must be up to haul Mr. Underwood out. I caught Atticus coming in the door, and he said that they'd moved Tom Robinson from the State Farm to the Maycomb jail. He also said that if they'd kept him there in the first place, there wouldn't have been any fuss. I watched him take a seat in the third row and heard him rumble, "Nearer, my God, to thee," some notes behind the rest of us. He never sat with Jim and me. He liked to be by himself in church. After supper that evening, Atticus came into the living room carrying a long electrical extension cord with a light bulb on the end. "I'm going out for a while," he said. "You folks will be in bed when I come back, so I'll say good night now." With that, he went out the back door. About 10 that night, I heard Jim rattling around in his room. I knocked on his door. "Why ain't you in bed?" "I'm going downtown for a while." He was changing his pants. "Then I'm going with you. If you say no, I'm going anyway." Jim saw that he would have to fight me to keep me home, so he gave in. I dressed quickly. We waited until Auntie's light went out and then walked quietly down the back steps. "Dill'll want to come," I whispered. So he will, said Jim gloomily. We went to Dill's window and Jim whistled Bob White. Dill's face appeared at the screen, disappeared, and 5 minutes later, he unhooked the screen and crawled out. An old campaigner, he did not speak until we were on the sidewalk. What's up? I've just got this feeling, Jim said. We went along to the post office corner. The south side of the square was deserted. Atticus's office was in the Maycomb Bank building. We saw his car parked in front of it, but he wasn't there. His office door was dark and locked. Maybe he's visited Mr. Underwood, Jim said. Mr. Underwood lived above the Maycomb Tribune office. To reach the office, we had to pass the jail. The Maycomb jail was the most venerable and hideous of the county's buildings. It was a miniature Gothic joke, 1 cell wide and 2 cells high, complete with tiny battlements and thick steel bars at its ecclesiastical windows. It was wedged between Tyndall's hardware store and the Maycomb Tribune, and some people said it looked like a Victorian privy. As we walked up the sidewalk, we saw a solitary light burning. That's funny, said Jim. Jail doesn't have an outside light. Looks like it's over the door, said Dill. A long extension cord ran between the bars of a second-floor window and down the side of the building. In the light from its bare bulb, Atticus was sitting propped against the front door. He was on one of his office chairs, and he was reading, oblivious of the night bugs dancing over his head. I made to run to him, but Jim caught me. Don't, he said. He might not like it. Let's go home. I just wanted to see where he was. We were taking a shortcut across the square when 4 dusty cars came in from the Meridian Highway, moving slowly in a line, and stopped in front of the jail. We saw Atticus looked up from his newspaper. Come on, whispered Jim. We streaked back across the square to Tyndall's hardware door, near enough, but at the same time discreet. In 1s and 2s, men got out of the cars and moved toward the jail door. He in there, Mr. Finch? A man said. He is, we heard Atticus answer, and he's asleep. Don't wake him up. You know what we want, another man said. Get aside from the door, Mr. Finch. You can go home again, Walter, Atticus said pleasantly. Heck Tate's around somewhere. The hell he is. Heck's bunch is so deep in the woods they won't get out till morning. Called him off on a snipe hunt. Didn't you think about that, Mr. Finch? Thought about it, but didn't believe it. Well then, my father's voice was still the same. That changes things, does it? It do, another deep voice said. Its owner was a shadow. Do you really think so? When Atticus asked that question twice in 2 days, it meant somebody's man would get jumped. This was too good to miss. I broke away from Jim and ran as fast as I could to Atticus. I pushed my way through bodies and burst into the circle of light. Hey, Atticus! I thought he would have a fine surprise, but a flash of plain fear went through his eyes. It returned when the boys wriggled into the light. There was a smell of stale whiskey and pig pen about, and when I glanced around, I discovered that these men were not the Maycomb people I had seen last night. Hot embarrassment shot through me. I had leaped into a ring of strangers. Atticus got up from his chair, moving slowly like an old man. He put his newspaper down carefully. Jim, he said, take Scout and Dill home. Jim did not budge. Go home, I said. Jim shook his head. As Atticus's fists went to his hips, so did Jim's, and as they faced each other, mutual defiance made them look alike. I'll send him home, a burly man said, and grabbed Jim roughly. Don't you touch him! I kicked the man swiftly. I was surprised him to see fall back in real pain. That'll do, Scout. Atticus put his hand on my shoulder. Don't kick folks. All right, Mr. Finch, get him out of here, someone growled. I ain't going, Jim said again. I looked around the crowd. The men were dressed, most of them, in overalls and denim shorts. Some wore hats pulled down over their ears. They were sullen-looking, sleepy-eyed men. I sought for a familiar face, and suddenly I found one. Hey, Mr. Cunningham. The man did not hear me, it seemed. Hey, Mr. Cunningham, how's your entailment getting on? Mr. Walter Cunningham blinked and hooked his thumbs in his overall straps. He seemed uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and looked away. My friendly overtures had fallen flat. "Don't you remember me, Mr. Cunningham? I'm Jean Louise Finch. You brought us some hickory nuts one time, remember?" I began to sense the futility one feels when unacknowledged by an acquaintance. "I go to school with your boy, Walter," I began again. Mr. Cunningham was moved to a faint nod. "He's in my grade," I said. "We brought him home for dinner one time." Slowly, I awoke to the fact that the men were all looking at me. Some, including Atticus, had their mouths half open. I began to feel sweat gathering at the edges of my hair. I could stand anything but a bunch of people looking at me. They were quite still. "What's the matter?" I asked. Atticus said nothing. I looked around and up at Mr. Cunningham, whose face was equally impassive. Then he did a peculiar thing. He squatted down and took me by both shoulders. "I'll tell Walter I seen you, little lady." Then he straightened up and waved a big paw. "Let's clear out," he called. "Let's get going, boys." In ones and twos, the men shuffled back to their ramshackle cars. Doors slammed, engines coughed, and they were gone. I turned to Atticus, but Atticus was leaning against the jail with his face to the wall. I pulled his sleeve. "Can we go home now?" He nodded, produced his handkerchief, gave his face a strong going over, and blew his nose violently. A soft, husky voice came from the darkness above. "They gone, Mr. Finch?" Atticus stepped back and looked up. "They've gone, Tom. They won't bother you any more." From a different direction, another voice cut crisply through the night. "You're damn tootin' they won't. Had you covered all the time, Atticus." Mr. Underwood and a double-barreled shotgun were leaning out his window above the Macomb Tribune office.